Did you know Nicolas Maduro said take everything and Donald Trump replied with silence so cold it echoed through the halls of power in Caracas? This isn't just another political story. This is about the moment a president tried to sell his entire country to save his own skin. March 2025. An encrypted message travels through diplomatic channels from Venezuela to Washington. Inside, an offer so desperate it would make any leader's hands shake. Nicolas Maduro, the man who once promised his people prosperity through socialism, was now willing to hand over every oil field, every gold mine, every natural resource his nation possessed. The price? Just let me stay in power. But before we understand how a president reaches this point of complete desperation, you need to see what was happening on the ground. Because while Maduro sat in his palace making billion-dollar offers, Maria Rodriguez was standing in line for the 7th hour that day, hoping to buy a single loaf of bread for her 3 children. Maria used to be a nurse. A good one. She saved lives. Now she spends entire days searching for food that costs more than her monthly salary. Her youngest daughter, Sophia, is 6 years old and has never tasted chocolate. She doesn't know what it means to have a full meal. When Maria tucks her in at night, Sophia whispers the same question. Mama, why are we always hungry? This is the Venezuela that Maduro was willing to trade away. Not the one in government speeches, but the real one, where doctors operate without anesthesia, where teachers faint from hunger in classrooms, where entire families cross deadly borders with nothing but hope in their backpacks. The country that once had more oil reserves than Saudi Arabia had become a graveyard of dreams. Inflation reached numbers so high they stopped making sense. 1,000,000%. 2 million. A teacher's monthly salary couldn't buy a single chicken. People were losing weight not by choice, but by survival. They even created a term for it, the Maduro diet. And in the middle of this catastrophe, Nicolas Maduro made his move. Not to help his people, but to save himself. Because the walls were closing in from every direction. The United States had declared him a fugitive. An international arrest warrant hung over his head like a sword. Former allies were distancing themselves. His own military generals were whispering in dark corners. He needed a miracle, or at least a deal that looked like one. That's when Richard Grenell entered the picture. Trump's special envoy, a man known for making impossible negotiations happen. For months, he had been the invisible bridge between two governments that officially refused to speak to each other. In secret meetings in neutral territories, in encrypted calls that lasted hours, Grenell listened to Venezuela's proposal. And what a proposal it was! Maduro wasn't offering small concessions or minor reforms. He was offering everything. American companies could have complete access to Venezuelan oil fields, the ones that still held billions of barrels underground. They could extract gold, mine rare minerals, control the entire energy sector. More than that, Maduro promised to cut ties with China, Russia, and Iran, the 3 powers that had kept him alive politically for years. Imagine that for a moment. A government willing to betray its closest allies, abandon its ideological foundations, and surrender its economic sovereignty just for one thing: political survival. Maduro was essentially saying, I'll become your puppet, just don't remove me from the throne. The proposal landed on Trump's desk with a translation that must have felt surreal even to read. Here was a socialist leader, someone who had spent years calling America the Great Satan, now begging to become a business partner. But what Maduro didn't understand was that this wasn't just about economics or even politics. This was personal. This was about principle. And more than anything, this was about the message it would send to every dictator watching from their own crumbling palaces. Because in Washington, there was one man who had already decided that making deals with Maduro would be a betrayal of everything America claimed to stand for. Marco Rubio had waited his entire political career for this moment. The son of Cuban immigrants, he had grown up hearing stories about strongmen who promised paradise and delivered poverty. He had watched his parents' homeland suffer under dictatorship. And now, as Secretary of State, he had the power to make sure history didn't repeat itself with Venezuela. When Grenell presented Maduro's offer to Trump's inner circle, Rubio didn't hesitate. His response was immediate and absolute. This man is not a president. He's a cartel leader in a suit. And we don't negotiate with drug traffickers, no matter how much oil they're offering. The tension in that White House meeting must have been suffocating. On one side, the pragmatists arguing about energy security, economic opportunities, and geopolitical advantages. On the other, Rubio painting a picture of moral compromise that would haunt American foreign policy for generations. And Trump. He listened to both sides, then made a decision that would change everything. But here's what nobody talks about. Here's the part that makes this whole story even more complex. While Maduro was making his desperate offer, while Grenell was trying to find middle ground, while Rubio was preparing his rejection, there was a fourth player in this game who nobody saw coming. Someone who would ultimately prove that Maduro's biggest enemy wasn't in Washington at all. If you're finding yourself pulled into this story of power, betrayal, and impossible choices, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about international politics and human nature. The rejection was coming. And it would be delivered in the most devastating way possible. The answer came not in words, but in actions that spoke louder than any diplomatic statement ever could. On March 18, 2025, exactly 3 days after Maduro's proposal reached its final review, the White House released a single-page statement. No press conference. No elaborate explanation. Just cold, clinical text that demolished years of secret negotiations in 14 sentences. The United States was severing all remaining diplomatic ties with Venezuela. Effective immediately. Richard Grenell, the man who had spent months building bridges, found out the same way the rest of the world did, through a news alert on his phone. He had been in the middle of drafting what he thought would be a compromise proposal when his entire mission became obsolete. Later, sources close to him would say he sat in silence for 20 minutes, staring at the screen, before finally closing his laptop. But the real devastation was happening 2,000 miles south, in a presidential palace where Nicolas Maduro had just learned that his last card had been rejected. Witnesses say he didn't rage or shout. He simply asked everyone to leave the room, then sat alone in the dark for hours. Because in that moment, he must have realized something terrifying. He had offered everything and received nothing. He had no moves left. To understand why this rejection destroyed him so completely, you need to understand who Nicolas Maduro really is. Not the strongman image he projects, not the revolutionary rhetoric he repeats, but the frightened man underneath who never wanted this burden in the first place. Maduro wasn't born into power. He wasn't raised in wealth. He grew up driving buses through Caracas streets, a working-class kid who joined a socialist movement because he genuinely believed it would help people like his own family. He met Hugo Chavez and saw in him a father figure, a mentor, someone who made him feel important for the first time in his life. When Chavez died in 2013, Maduro inherited more than a presidency. He inherited an impossible legacy, a collapsing economy, and expectations he had no ability to meet. Chavez had been a charismatic force of nature who could make people believe in miracles. Maduro was just a man trying desperately not to drown, using increasingly brutal methods to stay afloat. Every authoritarian decision, every opposition leader arrested, every protest violently suppressed wasn't confidence. It was terror. Terror that if he showed any weakness, the entire house of cards would collapse and take him with it. So he built walls instead of bridges, created enemies instead of allies, and slowly transformed from a believer into the very thing he once opposed. His closest aides describe a man who barely sleeps, who sees conspiracies everywhere, who understands his own people hate him but can't figure out how to change course without losing everything. He's trapped in a prison of his own making, and the key he offered Trump was rejected. But here's what makes this story even more tragic. While Maduro was making his billion-dollar offer, promising American companies unlimited access to Venezuelan resources, his own people were literally dying from lack of basic medicine. Hospitals in Caracas had become chambers of preventable death. Dr. Carlos Mendoza, who worked at one of the capital's largest hospitals, describes what the desperation looked like from inside. They performed surgeries with patients fully conscious because they had no anesthesia. They reused syringes until they broke. They watched children die from simple infections that any pharmacy in America could cure with a $10 bottle of antibiotics. I held a 7-year-old boy as he died from appendicitis, Carlos told international reporters who managed to sneak into the hospital. His name was Miguel. His appendix burst because we didn't have the equipment to diagnose it in time, and we didn't have the medicine to treat the infection. His mother screamed questions at me. Why? How? What kind of country lets children die like this? Carlos couldn't answer because the truth was too painful. They lived in a country where the president was offering billions in oil to foreign powers while his own hospitals had become graveyards. Where natural resources meant everything to international negotiations but nothing to the people who needed them most. And Maduro knew this. That's perhaps the most devastating part. He wasn't ignorant of the suffering. He received reports. He saw the statistics. He knew that every day he remained in power, more people died, more families fled, more hope evaporated. But his survival instinct was stronger than his conscience. After Trump's rejection, that survival instinct went into overdrive. Within 48 hours, Maduro appeared on state television with a speech that would have been laughable if it weren't so dangerous. He declared the American decision an act of war and promised that Venezuela would defend itself with all available means. What those means were became clear within the week. Reports started emerging of Venezuelan military movements near the Colombian border. Intelligence agencies detected increased communications between Caracas and known drug trafficking organizations. It was as if Maduro had decided that if he couldn't survive through diplomacy, he would survive through chaos. Marco Rubio watched these developments with grim satisfaction. To him, this was vindication. Maduro was showing his true nature, not a president trying to help his country, but a cornered animal willing to burn everything down rather than face justice. In a classified briefing to congressional leaders, Rubio laid out what he believed was really happening. This isn't about oil or sanctions or politics, Rubio said, according to leaked notes from that meeting. This is about a criminal organization that has taken over an entire country. They traffic drugs, they launder money, they enable terrorism. And now they're threatening their neighbors because we refused to legitimize their cartel with a trade deal. Trump needed no convincing. His next move would be so aggressive, so unprecedented, that even military analysts were shocked. He ordered the USS George Washington Carrier Strike Group to position itself off Venezuela's coast. American warships, dozens of them, creating a blockade that hadn't been seen in the Western Hemisphere since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The message was unmistakable: we rejected your offer, and now we're coming for you. Not with negotiations, but with pressure so intense you'll have no choice but to collapse or surrender. On the streets of Caracas, people watched American ships on the horizon through binoculars and felt something they hadn't experienced in years, a complicated mix of hope and fear. Hope that maybe, finally, their nightmare might end. Fear about what that ending might cost. Maria Rodriguez, still waiting in food lines, still trying to feed her daughter Sofia, looked at those ships and whispered to her neighbor, "Do you think they'll save us, or destroy what little we have left?" It was a question nobody could answer. Because while the world watched this high-stakes confrontation between Trump and Maduro, while military analysts predicted various scenarios, while diplomatic channels buzzed with speculation, there was something happening that nobody in Washington or Caracas had accounted for. Someone was making moves in the shadows. Someone who understood that the real power in Venezuela wasn't in Maduro's palace or America's warships, but in the will of a broken people who had nothing left to lose. And that someone was about to change the entire game in ways that would shock everyone watching. Her name was being whispered in living rooms across Venezuela, always in hushed tones, always with a glance toward the door. Maria Corina Machado. And while Maduro was offering his country to Trump, while warships circled like predators, she was doing something far more dangerous than either of them. She was organizing hope. 3 months earlier, before Maduro's desperate proposal, before the American rejection, Maria Corina had received a phone call that changed everything. It came at 3 a.m., the hour when only bad news or miracles happen. A voice she hadn't heard in 2 years told her 4 words that made her blood run cold: they're planning something worse. The caller was a former intelligence officer who had defected from Maduro's government. What he revealed in that 15-minute conversation was terrifying. Maduro's inner circle had contingency plans that involved burning the country down rather than letting it fall into opposition hands. Food warehouses would be destroyed. Oil facilities sabotaged. Evidence of their crimes erased along with anyone who could testify. Maria Corina sat in the darkness after that call, feeling the weight of what she now knew. She could stay safe in hiding, wait for international intervention, hope that Trump's pressure would somehow force Maduro out. Or she could do what terrified her most. Build a movement so powerful that when the regime finally cracked, there would be people ready to catch the pieces before they shattered completely. She chose the harder path. She always did. What most people didn't know was that she had spent the last 18 months building an underground network so sophisticated it would make intelligence agencies jealous. Not with guns or violence, but with something more powerful: information and organization. In safe houses across Caracas, in border towns, in forgotten villages, she had trained hundreds of coordinators who learned how to document regime crimes and prepare for the moment of transition. One of her key coordinators was Isabel Fernandez, a former accountant who had lost her husband to government violence during a protest 3 years earlier. Isabel's transformation from grieving widow to strategic resistance leader defined Maria Corina's entire movement. "I used to think fighting back meant screaming in the streets," Isabel explained during a secret meeting. "Maria Corina taught me that real resistance is quieter. It's memorizing regime officials' names and crimes. It's photographing convoys of stolen food. It's creating networks so when the day comes, we know exactly who did what." Isabel's network alone had documented over 3,000 specific instances of government corruption. Multiply that by hundreds of coordinators across the country, and Maria Corina was sitting on the most comprehensive archive of regime crimes ever assembled. An archive that would be crucial when the time came to rebuild with justice rather than revenge. But documentation wasn't enough. The real genius of her strategy was what she called parallel institutions. While Maduro's government crumbled, unable to provide basic services, her network quietly stepped in. Underground schools where real history was taught. Secret medical clinics. Community food distribution that helped people survive without government handouts. She was essentially building a shadow government, one that existed in the spaces where the official one had failed. So when collapse came, there would be something to fill the void immediately. No power vacuum. No chaos. Just transition. This terrified Maduro's security apparatus more than any American warship. Because you can fight warships with nationalism and defiance. How do you fight your own people organizing quietly, competently, preparing to replace you the moment you fall? That's why they hunted her relentlessly. Maria Corina hadn't slept in the same place twice in 14 months. Security forces had raided her family's homes 17 times, always coming up empty, always growing more frustrated. The price of this life showed in the gray streaks in her hair that appeared overnight, the tremor in her hands when she thought no one was watching. But it was during one of these endless nights in hiding that Maria Corina received news that would validate everything she'd been building. The Nobel Committee had awarded her the Peace Prize. Not for achieving peace, but for preparing the conditions that might make it possible. She read the message 3 times before believing it. Then she cried. Not tears of joy, but of overwhelming exhaustion and relief. Because this wasn't just an award. It was international legitimacy. It was protection. It was proof that the world was watching and wouldn't let her disappear quietly if Maduro's forces finally caught her. More importantly, it was a signal to every person in her network. What they were doing mattered. The world saw them. History would remember. But Maria Corina knew better than to celebrate. Awards don't overthrow governments. Preparation does. And she was about to put years of planning to the ultimate test. Because while the world focused on Trump's warships and Maduro's desperate moves, Maria Corina had received intelligence that changed everything. The same officer who had warned her months ago made contact again, this time with information so explosive it could end the regime within weeks. 3 of Maduro's top generals, the ones who controlled the military units that kept him in power, were ready to flip. Not out of patriotism, but because they saw the writing on the wall. American pressure was intensifying. The economy was beyond salvation. And most crucially, they had learned about Maria Corina's documentation of their crimes. They knew that when the regime fell, they would face justice unless they became part of the solution. They wanted to make a deal, immunity in exchange for removing Maduro peacefully and supporting a transition government. But they would only negotiate with Maria Corina, the one person who had both international legitimacy and the evidence to either condemn or spare them. This was the moment she had prepared for. But accepting meant coming out of hiding. It meant trusting men who had spent years enforcing Maduro's brutality. It meant gambling that her preparation had been thorough enough to prevent chaos. Maria Corina spent 3 days weighing this decision. Some advisors argued it was a trap. Others insisted it was their only chance. In the end, she made the choice by asking what would cause less suffering for the Venezuelan people. She agreed to meet with the generals. In secret. In a location so unexpected that even her own security team would only learn about it an hour before departure. The meeting was scheduled for April 2nd, exactly 2 weeks after Trump's rejection of Maduro's offer. The location, a private estate on the Colombian border, protected by international observers who had been convinced to provide security without asking too many questions. Maria Corina prepared for this meeting the way a general prepares for battle. She reviewed every piece of documentation. She memorized the generals' crimes, their families, their weaknesses. She rehearsed scenarios, prepared for betrayal, arranged for her network to continue if she didn't return. The night before, she wrote letters to her children, sealed them, left instructions for delivery if she disappeared. In those letters, she didn't apologize for choosing this path. She explained why some things are worth dying for. Then she erased any trace of sentimentality and became the leader her country needed. Fearless, strategic, uncompromising. What Maria Corina didn't know as she prepared was that her movements hadn't been as secret as she thought. Someone had been watching. Someone who had their own plans for how Venezuela's story should end. And that someone was about to make a move that would force Trump, Maduro, and Maria Corina herself into a confrontation none of them had anticipated. The clock was ticking toward a collision that would determine the fate of millions. April 2nd arrived with the kind of stillness that precedes earthquakes. Maria Corina's convoy crossed into Colombian territory at dawn, 3 vehicles moving through mountain roads that few maps acknowledged existed. She sat in the middle car, reviewing documents on a tablet that would be wiped clean the moment they detected any threat. Around her neck, a small device that would alert her network if she pressed it twice. A dead man's switch. If she disappeared, everything she knew would be released simultaneously to every major news organization in the world. The estate appeared through morning mist like something from another era. Colonial architecture, high walls, gardens that had seen better days. But what caught Maria Corina's attention were the vehicles already parked in the circular driveway. Not just the general's motorcade, but something else. Black SUVs with diplomatic plates she recognized immediately. American intelligence was here. They had known about this meeting all along. Her security chief turned to her, hand on his weapon, eyes asking the question, "Do we abort?" Maria Corina took 3 seconds to decide, then shook her head. If the Americans wanted her dead or captured, they wouldn't have bothered with this theatrical setup. They wanted something else. And she was about to find out what. Inside, the 3 generals waited in a room that smelled of old wood and newer fear. General Esteban Ruiz, commander of the Presidential Guard. General Patricia Moreno, head of military intelligence. General Carlos Vega, who controlled the armored divisions around Caracas. These 3 people had more Venezuelan blood on their hands than Maduro himself. They were the ones who gave the orders, who made the violence systematic, who transformed protests into massacres. And now they sat across from her, trying to look dignified while negotiating their own immunity. "Thank you for coming," Ruiz began, his voice carrying the false warmth of someone who had ordered executions before breakfast. "We believe it's time for Venezuela to save it," Maria Corina interrupted, her voice cold as winter steel. "I didn't come here for speeches. I came because you have something I need, and I have something you desperately want. So let's skip the performance and talk about what's actually happening. The generals exchanged glances, recalibrating. They had expected the politician, the diplomat, the woman who gave inspiring speeches about peace and democracy. They weren't prepared for the strategist who had spent 18 months building a shadow government while they hunted her. General Moreno leaned forward, decided to try a different approach. We have the power to remove Maduro within 72 hours. Peacefully. A military escort to the airport, a plane to a friendly country, and it's over. No civil war. No bloodshed. But we need guarantees. We need to know that when the transition government takes power, there won't be trials, imprisonments, revenge. You want immunity for crimes against humanity, Maria Corina stated flatly. You want me to tell the families of people you murdered that justice doesn't matter because political convenience is more important. We want to prevent more deaths, Vega interjected, his voice harder. You think taking down Maduro is the end? We know things you don't. We know about the contingency plans, the loyal units that will fight to the last bullet, the weapons caches hidden throughout the city. You remove us from the equation, and Caracas becomes a war zone that makes Syria look peaceful. Maria Corina felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down. She had prepared for this moment, rehearsed these arguments, but theory and reality are different countries. These men were offering her Venezuela's future on a silver platter, and the price was swallowing her principles. That's when the door opened, and the person who had been watching all along finally revealed themselves. Richard Grinnell walked in like he owned the place, and in a way, he did. The American envoy who everyone thought had been sidelined after Trump's rejection. The diplomat who had supposedly failed. But the smile on his face told a completely different story. Forgive the dramatic entrance, Grinnell said, his tone suggesting he didn't feel remotely sorry. But I thought it was time everyone in this room understood the actual situation we're dealing with. He placed a tablet on the table, pressed play. Video footage appeared. Security camera recordings from inside Maduro's palace. Audio from encrypted phone calls. Financial records showing numbered accounts in Panama, Switzerland, Dubai. And most damning of all, communications between these three generals and Maduro from just 48 hours ago. The generals' faces went white as they watched themselves discussing this exact meeting. Discussing how they would gain Maria Corina's trust, extract information about her network, then use that intelligence to destroy the opposition once and for all before fleeing the country themselves with millions in stolen money. It was a trap. But not the one anyone thought. You see, Grinnell continued, his voice pleasant in the way that precedes devastation. When Marco Rubio convinced President Trump to reject Maduro's offer, it wasn't just about principle. It was about this. We knew Maduro would get desperate. We knew he would try to eliminate the opposition before accepting defeat. And we knew his generals would try to play both sides until the very end. Maria Corina felt something shift in her chest. Not quite relief, not quite vindication, but something sharper. She looked at the generals, saw them realize their entire play had been transparent from the beginning. So what now? Ruiz asked, and for the first time, his voice carried genuine fear. Grinnell smiled. Now we discuss actual terms. Not the fantasy immunity you were pretending to offer in exchange for a coup you never planned to execute. Real terms. You testify against Maduro. You provide evidence of every crime, every account, every conspiracy. You help ensure the transition happens without the bloodshed you were threatening. And in exchange, you get trials in international court instead of Venezuelan justice. Fair trials. With lawyers. Due process. That's still prison, Moreno said quietly. That's still your life, Maria Corina responded, finding her voice again. Which is more than you gave to the thousands who died following your orders. You don't get to walk free. But you get to live. You get to face justice instead of revenge. And maybe, years from now, you get to tell your grandchildren that, at the end, you chose to help save your country instead of destroying it completely. The room fell silent. Outside, birds were singing, completely indifferent to the collapse of a dictatorship being negotiated inside. General Vega was the first to break. What guarantee do we have that any of this is real? That we won't testify and then find ourselves in a Venezuelan prison anyway? Grinnell pulled out a document, slid it across the table. Official United States government letterhead. Signatures from the Secretary of State, the Attorney General, even Trump himself. It was a formal agreement, cooperate fully, and they would be taken into American custody, tried in international court, and their families protected from retribution. President Trump rejected Maduro's offer to buy his way out, Grinnell explained. But he'll accept your testimony to bring him down properly. Through justice. Through exposure of every crime. Making sure the world sees exactly what this regime was. Maria Corina watched the generals read the document, saw the moment each one understood they had run out of options. They could accept this deal and live with guilt and consequences. Or they could stay loyal to Maduro and eventually face Venezuelan justice when the regime collapsed anyway, which would be far less merciful. Ruiz picked up a pen. His hand shook as he signed. Then Moreno. Then Vega. 3 signatures that ended a dictatorship not with bullets, but with betrayal from those who had sustained it longest. What happens now? Maria Corina asked Grinnell quietly. Now you go back to Venezuela and prepare your people, he replied. In 72 hours, these 3 will make a televised statement. They'll announce they're withdrawing support from Maduro and calling for immediate democratic elections. They'll reveal enough crimes to make it impossible for any remaining loyalists to justify supporting the regime. And then they'll surrender themselves to international custody. And Maduro? Maduro will have a choice. Leave voluntarily to avoid prosecution, or stay and face arrest. Either way, in less than a week, you'll be coordinating a transition government. Grinnell paused, studied her face. I know this isn't the ending you wanted. I know you wanted to see these men face Venezuelan justice immediately. But this is the ending that saves the most lives. Sometimes that has to be enough. Maria Corina thought about Isabel and her network of documentarians. About Dr. Carlos watching children die. About Maria Rodriguez still waiting in food lines with her daughter Sofia. About millions of Venezuelans who had suffered while these men gave orders and collected bribes. It's not enough, she said finally. But it's a start. The meeting ended. The generals were taken into American custody immediately, whisked away before Maduro could react. Maria Corina returned to her convoy, her mind already racing through everything that needed to happen in the next 72 hours. But as they drove back through mountain roads toward the border, her security chief handed her a phone. You need to see this. It's happening faster than anyone expected. The video showed chaos in Caracas. Not the kind Maduro's contingency plans had threatened, but something more powerful. Spontaneous celebration. Because somehow, impossibly, word had leaked about the general's defection. Not the details, not the deal, just the essential truth. The regime's military support was collapsing. People were pouring into the streets, not to protest or fight, but simply to exist without fear for the first time in years. And in those crowds, Maria Corina recognized faces. Isabel, coordinating groups to protect government buildings from looters. Dr. Carlos, setting up triage stations in case violence erupted. Hundreds of her network members, taking their positions, doing exactly what they had trained for. The parallel government was activating. Not in some distant future but right now. Filling the vacuum before chaos could take root. And in his palace, Nicolas Maduro watched the same footage, feeling walls that had been closing in for years finally collapse completely. His phone rang with calls from remaining loyalists demanding orders, but what orders could he give? His generals had abandoned him. His military was fracturing. His people were already celebrating his downfall. He had offered Trump everything and received nothing. Now he had nothing left to offer anyone. The only question remaining was how he would exit, with dignity or in handcuffs. And even that choice was rapidly being taken from him. Nicolas Maduro made his decision at 4:47 a.m. on April 5, exactly 63 hours after the general's defection. He didn't announce it dramatically or stage a final speech. He simply walked out of the presidential palace with 2 suitcases, climbed into an unmarked car, and drove to the airport where a plane waited to take him to Cuba. No entourage. No ceremony. Just a man who had clung to power so desperately that when it finally slipped away, he had nothing left to hold on to. The palace guards watched him leave and did nothing to stop him. Because what do you do when the person you've been defending finally admits, through his silence and departure, that there's nothing left worth defending? By sunrise, the news spread across Venezuela like wildfire. Maduro was gone. The nightmare that had consumed a generation was ending not with a bang, but with the pathetic whimper of a leader fleeing before consequences caught up. Maria Corina received the confirmation while coordinating transition teams from a secure location in Caracas. She read the message twice, then set down her phone and allowed herself 60 seconds of pure emotion. Not celebration, not triumph, but something deeper. Grief for all the years stolen, relief that no more would be taken, and crushing responsibility for what came next. Because ending a dictatorship is the easy part. Building something better, that's where most revolutions fail. Within hours, she was on television, not as a politician making promises, but as a leader giving instructions. Her message was direct, practical, honest in ways Venezuelan politics hadn't been for decades. Maduro is gone, but our work is just beginning. I'm asking you to channel your joy into rebuilding. For those seeking revenge, we will have justice through courts and evidence, not mob violence. And for those who are afraid, who worked for the government because you had no choice, hear this clearly. We need you. We need your willingness to help fix what was broken. It was radical. Most revolutions begin with purges. Maria Corina was proposing something far more difficult: integration, accountability, and reconstruction all happening simultaneously. Within 72 hours of Maduro's departure, her parallel institutions became official ones. The underground schools became the education ministry. The secret clinics became the healthcare foundation. The network of coordinators became the interim government structure. It was the smoothest transition anyone had seen in decades, shocking observers who expected months of chaos. But it wasn't perfect. There were still loyalist units to negotiate down, food shortages that wouldn't end overnight, economic disasters that couldn't be fixed instantly. And there were moments when Maria Corina, working 20-hour days, wondered if preparation alone could prevent chaos. That's when Isabel found her, 3 weeks into the transition, sitting alone in what used to be Maduro's office, staring at insurmountable problems. I thought it would be easier after he left, Maria Corina admitted quietly. Isabel sat beside her and said something Maria Corina would repeat countless times in difficult months ahead: it was never going to be easy. But easy isn't what we need. We need it to be real. And real change is messy and slow and frustrating. But it's also the only kind that lasts. 6 months after Maduro's departure, Maria Rodriguez stood in a supermarket with her daughter Sofia, looking at shelves that actually had food. Not abundance yet, but enough. More than they'd seen in years. "Mama," Sofia said, pointing to a chocolate bar. "Can we?" Maria looked at the price, calculated quickly, and realized something that made her throat tight. Yes. For the first time in her daughter's life, they could afford this small luxury. Sofia was 7 years old and about to taste chocolate for the first time. Maria bought the bar, unwrapped it carefully, and watched her daughter's face transform. It was such a small thing. Meaningless to people who had never known deprivation. But to Maria, watching her daughter's eyes light up, it represented everything. Possibility returning to a country that had forgotten what that word meant. She thought about Maduro in his Cuban exile, probably comfortable, never facing full accountability. She thought about justice incomplete and compromises necessary. And then she looked at Sofia, chocolate on her lips, smiling in a way children should always be able to smile, and decided that this moment of simple joy was also justice. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet rebuilding of normal life kind. The kind that matters most. Dr. Carlos Mendoza, who had watched children die from preventable causes, now worked in a hospital that still lacked resources but at least had hope. International aid was flowing. Medical supplies arrived weekly. They performed surgeries with proper anesthesia again. The recovery would take years, but it had begun. He thought often about Miguel, the 7-year-old who died from appendicitis. That memory would haunt him forever, as it should. But now he could at least tell Miguel's mother that her son's death hadn't been completely meaningless. That it had fueled the documentation that eventually brought down the regime. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. The 3 generals testified extensively, providing evidence that led to dozens of additional arrests. Their trials became templates for handling regime accountability without destroying reconciliation. They would spend years in prison, but their cooperation had prevented the bloodbath they had threatened. Richard Grenell returned to Washington with a transformed reputation. The diplomat everyone thought had failed had orchestrated one of the most sophisticated regime change operations in modern history. Not through military force alone, but through patience, intelligence, and understanding that real power lies with people, not leaders. 1 year after Maduro's departure, Maria Corina stood before the United Nations to receive her Nobel Peace Prize officially. She had been too busy with transition work to attend the original ceremony. In her acceptance speech, she said something that cut through all diplomatic complexity. Peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of justice, even incomplete justice. It's the presence of hope, even fragile hope. And most importantly, it's the willingness of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when their leaders fail them. I accept this prize on behalf of every Venezuelan who chose courage over safety, who chose preparation over despair, who chose to believe their country could be saved when every analysis said it couldn't. The phrase "take everything, just leave me in power" became a cautionary tale taught in Venezuelan schools about what happens when leaders value power over people, when personal survival becomes more important than national welfare. Venezuela's recovery continued, imperfect and ongoing. Elections were held, genuine ones. International investors returned cautiously. Refugees began coming home, not because everything was fixed, but because home was becoming livable again. The oil Maduro tried to trade for his survival? It was still there, still valuable, but now managed with transparency. The profits were invested in infrastructure, education, healthcare, the boring work of building a functional society that makes dramatic stories unnecessary. And every time someone suggested taking shortcuts or consolidating power for efficiency, Maria Corina would tell them about the phone call at 3 a.m., about Isabel's network, about Dr. Carlos and the children who didn't have to die, about choosing the harder path because it was the right one. The story didn't end with Maduro's departure. It's still being written by people who understand that the most important revolutions happen not in palaces, but in daily decisions of ordinary people choosing to build something better than what they inherited. So when you hear about dictators offering everything to maintain power, or situations that seem impossible to fix, remember this: change doesn't come from leaders making deals. It comes from people doing the hard work of preparation, even when success seems impossible. It comes from choosing justice over revenge, reconstruction over destruction, future over past. That's the real lesson from the man who said take everything, and the woman who replied by taking nothing except responsibility for building something better. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about what ordinary people can accomplish when they refuse to give up, then subscribe to this channel, because these are the stories that matter, the ones that show us how change actually happens when we're brave enough to make it real. The revolution wasn't televised. It was documented, organized, and implemented by people whose names you'll never know but whose work changed everything. And that's exactly how it should be.